Closer. Is that better? Okay. This common question that's asked is whether science and religion can coexist. And I have to agree, yes, they can coexist, but it's in the same way that humans and tapeworms can coexist, which isn't necessarily to our benefit. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about 3 particular examples where science and religion have been in conflict, where religion has been shown to be wrong. And of course, it doesn't seem to make much difference to the people involved in religion. They gradually adapt to these new ideas, but it takes them a good long while, and they're kicking and screaming the entire way. So first thing I want to do is I want to go a bit out of my depth. As was mentioned in the introduction, I'm a biologist. I'm going to talk a little bit about cosmology. So don't grill me too hard on this one. This is physics and astronomy. It's not my stuff, but I'm confining myself to 18th and 19th century astronomy, which I can keep up with. And I want to mention this guy, William Herschel, who everybody has heard of, right? You all know what he did, right? This is a test. What did William Herschel do that made him famous? You don't really know. Okay. William Herschel is most famous for discovering a planet. He discovered Uranus. Yes, I heard those titters. Stop it. The planet Uranus, okay. He discovered Uranus, which in a lot of ways was revolutionary for its time, because before Herschel, of course, everyone knew about the 6 classical planets, but they didn't know about anything beyond that. So this is something where he discovered something brand new that they hadn't even imagined. And he also kind of shook up the establishment a little bit because, well, you know, the classical planets, the ones that were known by the Greek scholars and so forth, were considered the end of everything. That's the total, sum total of the universe, is knowing about the planets and the stars. And yet here they are, out there beyond Jupiter and Saturn, there's another planet. So it shook them up a little bit. But that's not what really shook them up. And this is what I have to describe in a little detail to you, is he really changed the way people conceived of the universe. Now this is an illustration. It's kind of misleading. At the time of Herschel, no, people did not think the Earth was flat, and they didn't think that there was this dome of heaven touching the Earth at some place where somebody could poke his head through and see what was going on in the cosmic clockwork. But they did have this idea, and it's surprising how recent this was. So we're talking 18th century here. They did have this idea that the cosmos was bounded, that you had Earth at the center, Sun and the planets, the 5 other planets orbiting around it, and beyond that there was a dome of heaven of some thickness that was unknown, and it was like it had stars painted on it or punctured through it or something. They didn't know exactly what stars were, but here's this great dome of heaven surrounding us. And that was their idea, that you could actually imagine the universe was bounded, that our planet was right there at the center of everything. And Herschel is the guy who shook that up quite a bit. Herschel, what he was best known during his lifetime for, besides discovering the brand new planet, was as a meticulous observer. He was out there staring at the stars all the time. He was disciplined. He was very careful about this. He was also a great telescope maker. And he was really famous for that construction over there. That's his famous 40-inch telescope, which really pushed the edge of technology for the time. Nowadays, we have that thing over there. That's the 4.2-meter Herschel deep field scope in England. So this is the modern technology over there on the right. That's his construction back there in the 18th century. What he would do is stare at the sky, and he would carefully map everything that was out there. One of the things he did that really shook up, changed the way we thought of the universe, is he picked a part of the sky where there were no stars. Something where you couldn't see anything but blackness. And he aimed his telescope, his super powerful for that time telescope, at that little patch of sky. We've done the same thing nowadays with the Herschel Deep Field Scope, where you take, for instance, a little 7 arc-minute patch, tiny little patch of the sky, where to the naked eye there is absolutely nothing there. And you aim at the scope there, and you stare at it, and what do you see? You see this. So this is a photograph of just this tiny little patch of the sky. To your eye, there's nothing there. But then when you use a powerful scope, you see deeper and deeper and deeper, and you see all these stars out there. And furthermore, when he looked at these stars, he could also see with enough detail that some of those weren't stars at all. They were nebulae and galaxies. They were collections of stars. What he did when he observed this is he came up with this new idea, deep space, that there was not a boundary sphere that delimited the universe, that we were in the midst of this immensity, this gigantic universe that went deep and deep and deep, far out there, that there was this diversity of stars, and where once upon a time they thought, well, those little stars, those are the dim ones, and the bright stars are the big ones. Herschel said, no, that's not the case. What is those little stars are the ones that are very, very far away, and the bright ones are just closer, with some exceptions, of course. So suddenly he's opened up the boundaries of the universe and completely changed how we see things. That was pretty revolutionary for the time. Now, this work has been extended, of course, and nowadays we have a pretty good idea of deep time as well. And this was another concept that Herschel came up with. In his era, they knew that the speed of light was limited. They knew that it took a certain amount of time to get to certain places for a beam of light to get there. They knew it was very, very fast. But here Herschel's looking out in deep space and he's saying, well, you know, that thing and that thing over there are separated by millions of light years. Millions of something or other. He didn't have any precise conception of how far apart they were. He knew they were very, very far apart. And he realized it had to have taken millions of years for light to get from that star to us, which meant that the universe had to be very, very old as well. Now, of course, at that time, thinking very old was millions of years, and we now extend that. We now know it's billions of years old. It's about 13.7 billion years old. This is just an illustration of the history of the universe, that we now understand that there was a big bang, there was a rapid expansion of the universe, and then there was all this busyness going on over, so this is time in this direction, and until we get to the modern time where we've got these dispersed stars glowing brightly against the background. This is shocking stuff. At his, in his age, people thought the Earth was 6,000 years old because Archbishop Usher had told them it was 6,000 years old, and the Bible seemed to say that it was 6,000 years old. And here's William Herschel quietly explaining to everybody, no, the universe is very, very old. It's huge. We're obviously not exactly at the center of it. There's so much space out there. We're just a tiny speck in that universe. It's changing the concept of how we should think about who we are, where we are, what we are. Now, religious people aren't stupid. And at the time, what they had to do was reconcile what science was telling them and what religion was telling them. And they made an honest effort to do this. They have a number of explanations at the time that they use to explain, well, how could this be that, the Bible says, well, when you add up the genealogies, it's only 6,000 years old. Here's William Herschel telling us it's millions of years old. How do you reconcile this? And they had a number of different ways of doing this. This is my favorite. This is the gap theory. The gap theory looks at the book of Genesis and it says, okay, the first sentence is in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. And the second sentence is, and the earth was without form and void, et cetera, et cetera. And then it goes on through all the day-by-day accounts of how he created the universe. The gap theory says there's a period right there and a space. And then you go to that next sentence. And within that little gap, billions of years occurred. It just wasn't written down, which is actually a pretty good explanation. It also provides opportunities for lots of drama. What the people who advocated the gap theory said was, this is when all kinds of exciting things were going on. That war between Satan and the angels and God and so forth, that was all in the gap, in those billions of years. All that spectacular geology that we observe on the planet, you could explain that as the consequences of this cataclysmic war between demons and angels. They were throwing up mountains and carving canyons and blasting each other. It ought to make a movie someday. The gap theory would be the perfect one for this. This was actually the dominant explanation for many years. If you read the Schofield Reference Bible, which is kind of the Bible of the fundamentalist movement, this is the explanation that the fundamentalists endorsed. Here's a gap. The Bible doesn't explain everything. There's a whole bunch of stuff that wasn't filled in. We'll use that convenient gap to throw science into there. So geology, physics, biology, all that is explained by that billions of years gap. And then Genesis itself, those 6 days, what God is actually doing there is he's creating paradise. He's creating that little island of Eden. And so that was just describing a local event where God set up paradise for his chosen people, which is, again, a fairly sensible way to explain it all. It turns the Bible and Genesis into metaphor, an explanation of local events, not trying to contradict science. I kind of approve this. However, this has now fallen into disrepute. You will find very, very few people who actually endorse the gap theory anymore. What you'll more commonly hear is this theory, and this is called the day-age theory. Some of you may have encountered this yourself. They say, okay, well, you know those 6 days in the book of Genesis, they weren't necessarily 24-hour days. They could have been thousands or millions or billions of years because God can do anything. And so you just say, well, this is just a rough outline. It's metaphorical. It's not saying 24-hour days. It's just saying this is the order that God created things. Here's the events. It may have taken much longer than the poetry of Genesis would tell you. As this particular diagram says, though, that doesn't work. If you look at the order of things, you know that here God is creating waters, fruit trees, then the sun, then sea creatures, then mammals, etc. This is all wrong. That's not the way things happened. So this is flipping it all around. The other thing I'll mention is this diagram and the previous one that I showed you, they're from creationist sites. They're not from science sites. Scientists don't care about these theories. These are obsolete theories that have been thrown out, and they're just ad hoc excuses to fit the Bible to the actual events that we've recorded in history. So they're kind of phony. But creationists nowadays really, really hate the gap theory and the day-age theory. Most modern creationists will reject both of these. And so if you go searching for day-age theory and gap theory on the web, you'll get lots and lots of creationist sites that are sitting there refuting them. It's nice to see creationists shooting each other in the foot. It's entertaining, but it just tells you these are completely wrong. What do most creationists think nowadays? Well, if you want to find out what the most common creationist belief is, you have to go to this guy and Answers in Genesis. He's not the first who set this up. This was actually set up in the 1960s by a fellow by the name of Whitcomb and Morris, who wrote a book called The Genesis Flood, that attempted to reconcile the Bible to science by basically trampling over the science and ignoring it. What their hypothesis was, if you can even justify it with that term, is that yes, the earth was created in precisely 6 days, 6,000 years ago in 4004 BC. Exactly as Archbishop Usher had told them. This is now what Ken Ham promotes. It's also what Kent Hovind promotes. If you talk to most of the creationists that you'll find on the web who are on the lecture circuit, people like Eric Hovind and so forth, they almost all say Earth is just 6,000 years old, in defiance of the evidence. So this is an interesting tack. If you'd gone back before 1960 and you talked to the creationists, what you would find is an honest attempt, wrong-headed, I think, but still an honest attempt to reconcile their belief in God with the observable evidence. And nowadays, there has been a hardening of their position. Most creationists nowadays simply refuse to accept any of the evidence for science and have instead wholesale adopted this kind of ignorant sort of idea that, yeah, the Earth is only 6,000 years old. Ken Ham is probably the most prosperous proponent of this. He's making great money off of his Answers in Genesis website. I like to think of Ken Ham this way. If you can see the cartoon, that's God creating the Earth. He's got a little jar of spice there. It's called jerks, and he's sprinkling that on the Earth. And I think that's where Ken Ham came from. And if you go to Ken Ham's website, Answers in Genesis, if you go to the Creation Museum in Petersburg, Kentucky, you will find these views repeated over and over again. In fact, if you go through the museum with an open mind and actually ask, what is the message he's trying to tell you? The message he's trying to tell you is that everybody who says that the Earth is millions of years old is wrong. In fact, that's a mantra throughout the museum, is millions of years. And much of the museum is not directed at people like me. Ken Ham is so far beyond the pale. He doesn't care too much about what science says anymore. What he cares more about is what Christians say. He's very theologically minded. And this is a cartoon from his site that illustrates one of their primary points. See the smiling, happy guy over here? He's a young Earth creationist. And what he does is he accepts the Bible as the literal facts. The Earth is only 6 days, or was only 6 days old, or created in 6 days, 6,000 years ago. According to the language and the context, he says that's what you got to go with. And over there on the right, that is not a scientist, that's not an atheist. That is one of those evil liberal Christians. The ones who do things like interpret it with the day-age theory. They're the enemy. They're the ones they're really worried about because they're still trying to reconcile science and religion. And Ken Ham says, no, forget that. When you go through the museum, one prominent display is this one. They have this entire huge room with a false front for a church. They've got a church built up there, and that's a wrecking ball smashing the church down. It's labeled millions of years. Millions of years is the phrase they hate. Go to Ken Ham and say, well, the Earth is billions of years old, and he will get very upset with you. That's completely false. The Earth is only 6,000 years old, and don't argue with him otherwise. Anybody who says millions of years is an enemy of the faith. The other thing you'll find in the entire Creation Museum is this kind of idea that basically science is something disposable and expendable. This is a cartoon where he's really abusing the evidence. It's a cartoon that's illustrating the creationists, again, the blonde guy on the left, and he's talking with a couple of guys who are saying that the reliable facts are written by scientists, and he's got this book called Science Facts 1997, and it's obsolete. There's Science Facts 1998, so you throw out the old book. It's a complete misrepresentation of the way science works. Yes, science adapts, but we don't throw out facts. Facts remain. Facts are consistent. We don't change the facts on you. We may change the explanations for you as more facts come in, and we can refine our explanations and make them a little better. But this is complete dishonesty on his part. Now, this is a substantial problem. Reality contradicts the Christian view of history. It just does. Ken Ham has taken the path of least resistance in his mind, and that is, well, let's deny history then. Let's deny science. That's the way to simplify everything so we can promote a biblical view. He is not an honest negotiator in the field of science and history, because what he's basically saying is science is all wrong. Only the Bible is true. So, there are sensible theologians out there. I said it before and I'll say it again. There are smart religious people. There's nothing about religion that makes you necessarily stupid, but it can lead you to very stupid conclusions. There are many religious people who try very hard to bend and evolve and acquire a more nuanced vision of how the world works, who are willing to admit, yeah, the evidence all says the Earth is billions of years old, space is immense. We have to fit our religion to that. But unfortunately, for every sensible Christian or other member of a religious dogma who believes that, there's about a dozen ham-handed tribal apes who have this certificate from a Bible college, and they wave it around. And they say that reason and religion are mortal enemies, which I kind of agree with. But unfortunately, from their point of view, reason is the one that you have to throw away, not the religion. And so you have to accept their religion. I want to mention a couple more examples. So I'm going to change gears a little bit here. I want to talk about another example where religion has been wrong, and it's also got some rather unpleasant consequences. And for this, I want to turn to something I'm much more comfortable with than in cosmology. I want to talk about developmental biology. And I'm going to mention some fancy words here, preformation and epigenesis. I teach developmental biology every other year. I'm going to be teaching it this fall. I'm looking forward to it, finally getting back into the classroom again. And this is what I always start the developmental biology course with, is we talk about this fundamental concept of preformation and epigenesis. And of course, everybody here knows exactly what I'm talking about, right? No, I better explain. This is an old debate. This is something that was talked about by the Greeks in the 3rd century BC. This is something they argued about a long time ago, 2,300 years ago. This fellow here, Hans Adolf Edward Driesch, did an experiment, and I'll talk about this experiment in a moment, that actually showed what the right answer was, although it turns out he couldn't accept it. But let's go back to the primal debate. Like I told you, this is ancient debate. Pre-formation was first advanced, as far as we know, by this guy Anaxagoras, a Greek philosopher, and he had this very simple idea. How can hair be made of what is not hair, and flesh of what is not flesh? These seem to be very substantial, indivisible things. How can you take something and turn it into hair? There doesn't seem to be a way to do this. Hair is a primal material, flesh as well. You cannot make flesh in the kitchen or the laboratory, at least not in the 3rd century BC. And so he advanced this idea of preformation. That's the idea that the gametes contain a complete preformed specification, or even the complete physical form of the adult. And there in the middle is an illustration from a guy named Hertzhoker in 1694, which shows what they thought was going on, that there's sperm, and in that sperm there's a little baby. And what happens in development is the man comes along and he plants the sperm in the fertile womb of the woman. The woman is a kind of kiln who will bake the baby into growth. And then all that happens in development is it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it's ready to come out. So everything that is there in the sperm. Aristotle is on the right on this one, both literally and metaphorically. Aristotle, he had this idea called epigenesis. He says, yeah, things change. There has to be some kind of transformation. And this comes from a straightforward observation of looking at semen. Now, I know most of you haven't seen this stuff, right? But semen is this pale white sticky stuff. It's kind of unpleasant looking. It doesn't contain hair or flesh, okay? It's kind of liquid. It comes out of the penis, which is a very peculiar place for things to be emitted. And he said, okay, admit right out that you can make blood and flesh and hair and all these other things from semen, but semen isn't blood and flesh and hair and bone and all these other things. And from his writings, it's clear that he's done experiments and observations where he poked around in semen, and he asked, well, are there any bones or eyeballs or anything in here? And he couldn't find any. And being a male chauvinist pig, he knew, deep in his brain, that males have to be the important ones. They have to be the ones that are contributing the baby to the female. She's just a vessel to grow the baby in. So he knew that had to be the source of the baby, but there's no baby there. And so he came with this idea of epigenesis, the idea that organisms are formed by progressive development and differentiation of a relatively unorganized substance. So you take something that's unorganized like semen and give it time, the right environment, and it will transform itself into bones and blood and muscle and skin and hair. Okay, so those are the two dueling ideas, preformation versus epigenesis, and people fought over these for centuries. This wasn't resolved until late in the 19th century. So people fought over this for a long time. The key experiment is this one, and this is what Driesch did. Driesch was working with sea urchins. Sea urchins are just a really easy embryo to work with. You can get thousands of embryos from a sea urchin. It's really easy to stimulate them to start producing these things. And when you get them, they're easy to work with. They're big embryos. So very convenient sort of animal. That's the only reason we're working with sea urchins here. And what he said is, okay, well, let's do a simple experiment. We'll start with a 4-cell embryo. That's what's illustrated up there. There's our 4-cell embryo. And like I said, sea urchins are easy to work with. What you can do is you can just peel off this little chorion, this membrane that surrounds them, and you keep them in seawater and you put them in a test tube and just shake it up, and they fall apart. So you take those 4-cell embryos and you break them up into 4 individual cells, and then you put them in petri dishes and grow them separately. And Driesch was a preformationist. He had this idea, well, the embryo is obviously here, and so what must happen is, oh, well, this is going to be the back left part of the embryo, the back right, this is the front left, and this is the front right. So when you cultivate these and grow them separately, he predicted that what you'd see is these little quarter parts of an embryo emerging in the petri dish. And so he did this experiment. It's really easy to do. I've done it. You can do it in any lab that has access to seawater and sea urchins. Unfortunately, Minnesota is not a great place for either. But if you're on the coast, this is a really easy experiment to do. And this is the result. You get, this is a normal larva of a sea urchin. It looks kind of like the space shuttle. What you get when you do this experiment is you get 4 perfect little space shuttle-shaped larvae. They're smaller than the normal one, but they're all perfect. And when you let them grow a little while and feed and develop, you get complete, intact, perfectly normal, perfectly healthy sea urchins out of it. Whoa. Drisha's mind was blown by this, okay? He could not understand this. From an epigenetic point of view, it's not hard because epigenesis says there have to be interactions that produce embryos, and that makes sense. But from a preformationist point of view, this made absolutely no sense. That means every single cell contains a complete embryo? That doesn't make sense either. So anyway, like I said, Drisha's mind was totally blown. He later joined the Catholic Church. Predictable, I know. And what he proposed is this idea called the entelechy. He says what there's a guiding field or intelligence that directs the development of the organism. He couldn't imagine that they would do this autonomously, that they would just be able to figure out by negotiation with their environment how to build a new embryo just from this starting point right here. So he said there had to be some kind of intelligence, a unifying non-material mind like something, an ordering principle which does not add either energy or matter, and that carries out morphogenetic action at a distance. He's clearly imagining God reaching down and tweaking every little embryo and guiding it in its pathway. This is wrong, okay? That's not how it works. That modern developmental biology has worked out all the details of this. We understand this perfectly. If, you know, from the context of what we know now, this result makes perfect sense. This is something called regulation. That what happens in the embryo is you've got a single cell that does not contain an embryo, but what it does, it divides and divides and divides, produces this mass, and the cells then interact with each other, they interact with the environment. Cells that are at one end figure out, oh, well, I'm the front end, I'm supposed to make a head here. Cells at the other end say, oh, I'm at the back end, I have to make a tail here. And they use the information in DNA in the nucleus to produce the appropriate structures. So this makes sense to us. We have another experiment that was done in the 1920s by Hilda Mangold and Spemann. Spemann was the head of the lab. Spemann won the Nobel Prize. Mangold did not. This is a lesson to any of you who are graduate students. Your boss is going to steal your work. Just get used to it. So Spemann gets the Nobel Prize for this. It's a very simple experiment. He's looking at a frog here, or in this case a newt. And when you look at a frog, this is later in development after you've made a mass of cells, and the cells start moving and building the embryo itself. And the earliest structure that you can recognize is this one. It's called the dorsal lip. And what it is a place where mass of cells are rolling in to the interior of the embryo. They're going to make, the cells that roll in are going to make the gut, and they're also going to make things like the notochord and other mesodermal structures. They're going to make muscle and gut, okay? So they're going to roll in and do this business in here. And it's a distinctive feature. You can spot this. Hilda Mangold had the hands, and so she did this experiment where what she did is she took one embryo and she neatly snipped out this dorsal lip, and she transplanted it into a second embryo in the wrong place, the back side of the embryo. So this is the dorsal lip of this other, of the host embryo. Here's where she's transplanted the dorsal lip. So now you got a newt with 2 dorsal lips. And what happens? Well, it's shown right here. This transplanted dorsal lip will go on and make a whole new embryo. And you get these Siamese twin embryos out of it. The interpretation is that the dorsal lip contains something called the organizer. It's a source of information. It's a source of polarity that says, okay, where have you got this particular material? That is the dorsal part of the embryo. That's the back side of the embryo. And it tells all the cells around it that they're supposed to contribute to things like mesoderm, muscle, and gut. And they all follow the lead of this dorsal lip, and they make whatever structure is appropriate. So again, set of interactions. This tissue is talking to its neighbors, telling them, you're in this particular place in the embryo, you're supposed to make this. And they all follow that lead. And similarly, when the dorsal lip is here, it just tells these neighbors over here, which normally would be contributing to abdominal structures, that no, you're on the back side. You're supposed to make the dorsal structures, and they do. And then this is just a further illustration of this. It's recruiting cells from the neighborhood to do this. So what this is it's a point that is thoroughly, absolutely, solidly established in biology right now. The embryo is not the adult. There is no little baby inside of a sperm cell or an egg cell. The sperm and the egg do not contain the full information present in the newborn. That has to be generated progressively by these kinds of interactions. So that gamete is not the embryo. What has to go on in these complex internal negotiations that build an increasingly complex embryo? And what we can say is that the oocyte, the human oocyte, is a human cell, but it is not a human being. Not yet. It's going to take development to turn a cell into a full human being. Unfortunately, the masses have not gotten this message. I know it's an abstract point. It's kind of hard to get across to people that no, there isn't some abrupt transition where all of a sudden, bam, you got a human being in there. It takes time and gradual development to do that. I have to mention this organization, Pro-Life Across America. It's based right here in Minneapolis. Aren't you proud? They have billboards all over. You know, when I make my drive out here from Morris, Minnesota, and you go along Highway 28 there, these billboards are all over the place. And they all say exactly the same thing. They're all pretty much reproducible from one to the other. They all contain a nice picture of a cute baby. And we all like babies. Well, most of us. They're adorable. And they all have some little fact extracted from developmental biology. So for instance, there it says, I had fingerprints 9 weeks from conception. Wow. Yes, it's true, you do. But, you know, we do not define human being by the existence of fingerprints, because lots of animals have fingerprints. That's no big deal. They also say things like, let's see, oh, heartbeat, 18 days from conception. Cute little baby. Oh, isn't that nice? Her heart started beating at 18 days after fertilization. This is no big deal, though. I raise zebrafish, and zebrafish hearts start beating 20 hours after fertilization. Obviously, zebrafish are better than humans. And again, we do not define humanity by the fact that they have contractile muscular tissue. That's not that big a deal. If that's how we define humanity, you'd have to stop eating hamburgers at McDonald's, because that's all made from contractile muscular tissue. Further examples here. This is a typical sign. Face it, I had eyes, ears, and even my tongue. 28 days from conception. This one infuriates me because in human beings, the 28-day mark is a really interesting period in development. It's called the Pharyngula stage. You may know from the name of my blog, I have a certain obsession with this particular period of development. And it is true that at 28 days, that's when you start forming eyes, ears, and your tongue. It's also when you've got a tail. They don't mention this. Also, the 28-day embryo does not look anything like this. Here's what a 28-day-old embryo looks like. And yeah, okay, right here, that's where the eye is. Cute, isn't it? Blue eyes right there. No, you can't tell. Over here are these branchial arches, these little structures that hang down from the cranium. That's going to form the tongue. This is going to form the ears back here. But it hasn't yet. What you got is a little flap of tissue that will differentiate into those structures. And I think you'll agree this is nowhere near as cute as the newborn infant. This is a pretty hideous looking thing. It's also only about this big, okay? So they're really misrepresenting things. Oh, and by the way, there's the tail. Yes, we got a very nice tail at 28 days. Here's another example. I got my genes at conception. I am unique. Yes, big deal. Again, we illustrate it with this nice picture of a baby. This is totally inaccurate. At conception, the baby looked like this. And yes, it has its full suite of genes there, but Seriously, every single cell in your body has this full suite of genes in it. I'm sorry, your fingerprint, you know, those little cells there, each one of those has this full suite of genes. It's just as much a human, if you define humanity by the presence of genes, as this thing. This, by the way, is just a picture of an oocyte at the time of fertilization. And what you see here is an egg cell in the middle of this mass of little squiggly things. Those are all the frustrated sperm that did not make it in. So there, a bunch of dead genes. They're not going to make it. They're going to be thrown away. Now, obviously, this is totally irrational. This has no basis in reality what these billboards are arguing. They're misrepresenting developmental biology. They are nicely stealing developmental biology facts and misusing them. I hate it. There it is. It's like every time I take this drive, I see my chosen discipline being whipped and abused and maltreated by these people from pro-life across America and the Minnesota organization that also puts these signs up. And it's annoying. This is simply not reality. And what it leads to is unpleasant conclusions. So I want to just mention this one example. This is a Catholic theologian, Dr. Alice von Hildebrand, and she has written books apparently that are very influential in the Catholic community, where she makes these assertions like, when a wife conceives a few hours after her husband has embraced her, nice euphemism. And here, God creates the child's soul in her body. Whoa. So if we just step back, there's a soul in there? All right. What is exactly a soul? She has nothing to say about this. This is essentially bullshit just pulled out of her ass right here. And then she continues, as you certainly know, yeah, really, okay, neither husband nor wife can produce the human soul. How do we know that? Because Alice von Hildebrand tells us so. God alone can create a soul. Again, where is this? I mean, where's the evidence for this? Show me an experiment. Show me Drisha's experiment where he shows this sort of thing, and you can't. There's a personal contact between God and the woman, which once again gives to the female body a note of sacredness. Doesn't that make you ladies feel special? Yes. But anyway, we've got this nonsense. This is gibberish. This has no meaning at all. It's total drivel. If you read the Bible, it's fairly casual about embryos. The Bible doesn't say much about embryos at all. In fact, it treats pregnant women as sort of commodities with a little extra potential value added. So if you harm a pregnant woman, you have to pay a little extra penalty. That's about it. That's all the Bible says about pregnancy. It doesn't say anything about a soul coming in at a particular time. This is stuff that has practically no substance at all to it. But these are rules that are being established by the Bible that are being used to dictate what women should do with their bodies. This is a great harm to society when people accept this kind of nonsense as equivalent to fact. So again, we know where most conservatively religious people have fallen. They've fallen for this kind of emotional, absolutist, and seriously wrong answer, one that ignores modern developmental biology. Okay, one more example. I got 15 minutes. Let's see if I can get through this. Let's get into stuff I'm really comfortable with, okay? Evolution, natural selection, common descent, all this kind of thing. This is Charles Darwin. I suppose you've heard of this one. Most of you have heard of him, 1809, 1882. Great scientist who observed a whole bunch of things and came up with this wonderful theory. He had this great idea to explain how we arrived at all the diversity that we see on planet Earth. And he postulated this idea of common descent. He said that when you look at all these different species, and the example he used, he looked at finches, for instance, and he saw, here are all these finches on the Galapagos Islands, and they're different from one another, and they're different from the mainland species, but they're different in predictable ways that show that maybe the species as a whole has responded to its environment and has adapted to its environment. And so he said, well, if this group of finches are obviously related from mainland finches, perhaps we can extrapolate back and say that about everything. Human beings, for instance, seem to look very similar to chimpanzees and gorillas. Maybe we're related to them. That means we're related by this tree of descent back to more primitive animals. He said, hypothetically, he did not have all the evidence for this. He said, hypothetically, that suggests that we could trace everything back to a single or maybe a few ancestral organisms. How long ago? He didn't know. He said, well, okay, millions of years ago. There was a common ancestor for all forms of life on the planet. We now know it was more like 4 billion years ago, so time is dilated a little bit in these times. But we're still saying the same thing. This is a beautiful diagram from a guy named Hillis in Texas. You can find this on the web. You just search for Hillis and ask for, look for his tree of life diagram. What this is something Darwin didn't know about. What they've done is they've taken the genetic sequences. They've sequenced DNA from these animals. And they've asked, how related are they? And using this, you can build tree diagrams. And these tree diagrams, for instance, what this is showing is, this is us over here. It's very tiny, but it says, you are here. If you search for this on the web, you'll discover it's a PDF. And it's lots of fun because you can zoom in on it. And you see each of these little gray blurs there? Those are all species names. So these are all species who've been genetically sequenced, and we know something about their DNA. And you can say, okay, well, here's us. And if you look, again, more closely at this than this tiny little diagram can show you, you can see that you're related to chimpanzees, you're related to gorillas, et cetera. You're related to apes. You can trace these back to more primitive monkeys, all the way back to reptiles and so forth. And in fact, you can follow this tree all the way back, following this all the way through, back to a last common ancestor. This is about 4 billion years ago. And similarly, you can look at plants, you can look at protists, you can look at fungi, you can look at the archaea, the various bacteria. This really ought to be expanded, but there haven't been that many sequenced yet. And you trace these all the way back. We're all related by this beautiful tree diagram. It's by a guy named Hillis, Hillis. Search for Tree of Life in Hillis, and Google should turn it up for you. I've got the PDF on my computer. If you want to see it afterwards, we can look at it. You just zoom in and zoom in and zoom in, and you can see this in greater and greater resolution. It shows you the extent of the information that we now have about the molecular relationships between all these different forms. Yes, you are related to bananas. Ray Comfort was right. Evolution does say that. We are related to bananas, but it's very distantly, the branch is somewhere back in here, a couple billion years ago. So we've got this wealth of information. It's amazing. But I'll remind you, James Ussher. So back in the 17th century, James Ussher came up with this other idea that we're all created in 4004 BC over 6 days, as described in the book of Genesis. And you're looking at this and saying, oh, compare those two. This is beautiful and new. This is full of information. The information density in this diagram is immense. Ussher's got this, which is reciting the genealogies of the Bible. You say, well, that's all outmoded. This is all wrong. And you'd be right. However, I will point out that where I got this particular picture was from an advertisement I received in the mail. This was sent to me by WorldNet Daily. You may have heard of this. It's a very conservative, far right-wing website, surprisingly influential. It's all over the place. This is something from this year where they're saying that Ussher's chronology is an accurate reference, highly regarded for its precision. And it says that it calls to mind the fact that the Earth is only around 6,000 years old. And they're complaining about the church's backsliding into deceptive ideas of evolution. My mind boggles every day that people are still swallowing this nonsense. They have no appreciation for the evidence. When you go through Ken Ham's museum, same thing everywhere. This is just a diagram that they have in the museum. This is their model of how life evolved. And it's surprising. They actually accept big chunks of evolution nowadays. They have to because the evidence is so strong. But what they say is that there are kinds that developed, that evolved. That, for instance, here's a tree, here's a butterfly. I have no idea what that is. Triceratops, there's some kind of worm, there's a mushroom. And they're saying, oh, those were all created independently. And yes, there was some variation. In this diagram, there's the global flood, which occurred in 2348 BC, precisely. Wiped everything out, so there's only one of each kind, and then they resumed branching and diversifying now. So this is all evolution here. The one difference they have is, well, there's a couple differences. Big one is the time scale. They're saying all this happened over 6,000 years, which, I've talked to evolutionary biologists about this, and they're really impressed at the rate of evolution that must be going on in the creationist mind. It's really immense. The scientific version is this one over here, which is a constantly branching tree, but it goes back 4 billion years. This goes back 6,000 years, and they're saying about the same amount of change had to have occurred there. So that's one big thing, is the rate, the timing, and the fact that they're delimiting it. Darwin had this same evidence, and we said, why do we arbitrarily draw these lines here, other than that the Bible says so? We ought to be able to just continue this branching back and relate all these forms to one another, which is what they've done in the modern conception of evolution. And we've also got the evidence, the molecular evidence, to back this up. The other thing that I want to bring your attention to in this diagram is this up here. Throughout the museum, reason and God's word are presented in opposition. They are enemies of each other. They say over and over again, if you accept the evidence of reason, you're betraying God's word. So, I know, this is the atheist group. There probably aren't very many Christians here. But I think there are a lot of Christians out there who would realize that this is kind of a bad idea to set up your faith in opposition to reason. But this is what the modern creationists are doing. I'll also point this one out. This is a similar sort of diagram. This one is showing us. Notice, we don't branch. We're special. We're made in the image of God, so there is no variation allowed in the human race. Quite different from this form over here. The apes went nuts and branched all over the place. And in fact, at the museum, what they do is they say, okay, all those hominid fossils out there, those are just mutant apes. They have no relationship to human beings. So Lucy, just a monkey. Neanderthal man, just a monkey. And again, this is all set up. This is what God's word says. I dare you to find Lucy mentioned in the Bible, though. There is not one mention of Australopithecines in the Bible at all. But yet they're saying this is God's word. This is the way it had to work. Okay, I mentioned Neanderthals. I gotta say a little bit about Neanderthals, because Neanderthals have been in the news lately. Have you noticed? Has anybody heard about this amazing piece of work? They have sequenced the Neanderthal genome. Blew me away. This was announced 2 weeks ago. What these researchers had done is they'd gone back to some old fossils, and these are the specific ones they looked at here, and they had taken a little tiny core out of each one, so they got deep into the bone and tried to get away from the surface, which was contaminated and covered with bacteria and human fingerprints and things like that. They dig deep into the bone, they pull out a little pellet, and they pulverize it, and they take it apart, and they sequence what they find there. This is really impressive work. The specimens they worked with are just shown here. There's Neanderthal man himself. Neanderthal man, we think he evolved about 400,000 years ago, went extinct about 30,000 years ago. So he's a recent neighbor. And the other thing I have to mention about this is Neanderthal man then existed for 370,000 years. How old is the human species? We're about 150,000 years old. So Neanderthal man was not a failure. Neanderthal had a pretty good run there and was more successful than we have been so far. We've got a couple 100,000 more years of survival before we can say, we did as well as Neanderthal. Okay, so there's this old fossil here. Modern humans we evolved roughly between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago. We spread throughout Africa and we emerged into the Middle East about 80,000 years ago. And that's when we collided with Neanderthal. So remember, Neanderthal went extinct 30,000 years ago. Modern humans moved into the same territory as Neanderthals about 80,000 years ago. That meant there was about a 50,000 year overlap where we could have bumped into them, where we almost certainly did. The specimens that they're working with are these over here. These bones are 38,000, 44,000, and 44,000 years old. They're all from the same cave in Croatia, the Vindia caves in Croatia. The other thing I have to note here is these bones are 38,000 years old, which according to creationists is about 6 times older than the entire universe. Worth noting. And the other thing is, This bone is 38,000. This one's 44,000. There's 6,000 years between them. So just the separation of these few specimens is about the same as the creationists say is the entire duration of the universe. Again, kind of impressive. They fully sequenced these. Again, a very impressive achievement, because when you pulverize these bones, you dig around, what you discover is that 95 to 99% of the DNA you pull out of the bone is bacterial, as you might guess. These bones have been rotting for a long, long time. So one of the things they have to do is they have to extract the bacterial signal from the human signal, so the human signal is only a tiny fraction of that. Furthermore, all the DNA is greatly degraded. The average size of a piece of DNA is 200 base pairs. So it's been chopped up by time and enzymes and broken down. Basically, what they're doing when they do this kind of research is they're looking deep in the bone for isolated little cells that are buried in little lacunae in the bone and that have not been directly attacked by bacteria. So there's no bacterial contamination on them. You're trying to pull that out and pull the signal out of that. So these are cells that are dead, that are fallen apart, but aren't surrounded by bacteria. But of course, you're still getting bacteria all over the place, so you still have to extract all the information. The DNA has also been extensively degraded by chemical processes. They have to correct for that. It's really hard work, and it's very impressive that they've done it. What they have to do that the creationists do not is they have to speak a different language, the language of mathematics. What you have to do is you have to sequence all this DNA, put it back together into its order, and ask, okay, how different is that from what you find in modern humans? And this is a very complicated diagram. I won't go over it all, but basically what they do is they look at these sequences and they say, okay, well, we can quantify the differences. So for instance, this is the lineage that led to chimpanzees. And we can also use this other information. We can extrapolate back and say, what was the sequence of the last common ancestor of chimpanzees, Neanderthals, and modern humans? So yeah, we can figure that out now. We can say roughly what their sequence must have been like. We ask how many changes, the number of changes that occurred in this lineage. And we can say, well, it was about 449,000. So say, 500,000 DNA changes between a human being and a chimpanzee. We can similarly ask these same numbers over here. We ask how many differences are there between this individual. This would be the last common ancestor between humans and Neanderthals. This would have been somebody who lived about 400,000 years ago. Okay, so how many changes have occurred there? And again, we can get some nice numbers. Neanderthal had about 100 or so thousand changes. Some of those, this number is probably inflated a little bit because there is chemical modification. It's difficult to sort out what's degradation versus what's the actual sequence. And humans have acquired about 30,000 changes in our DNA in this period of time, 400,000 years, which is kind of cool. Working out these ancestral sequences and figure out exactly where we are in relation to each other. But the way we can use this is we can now ask, what were the changes? What made us different from Neanderthal? What makes us different from chimpanzees? And here's some of the models they're working with. So they look at these, and they look through all these genes that are in the human sequence. They look through all the genes that are in the Neanderthal sequence, and they can ask these things like, okay, which ones have stayed the same? The boring ones. Which genes have very little change between Neanderthals and humans? And we can sort of ignore them for now. We'll just get rid of those. We can also ask, are there genes that are novel in Neanderthal man, that are different in Neanderthal man from the common ancestor of humans and Neanderthals? These are genes like this that arose long ago in the family tree. So this is the last common ancestor of humans and Neanderthals, which is a population of Neanderthal human-like creatures. Here's the Neanderthals over here. We ask, okay, well, what about some interesting novel genes, new things that arose that may have been important in making you a Neanderthal? And we can follow those. We can figure out what those are. And interestingly, what they were looking for also is genes that are unique to Neanderthal man and also unique to subpopulations of humans, modern humans, us. And this is where it gets kind of interesting and a little bit kinky, because they discovered that, there are genes that arose by, or forms of genes that arose by a novel mutation probably 400,000 years ago, between 400 and 200,000 years ago, that you find widespread through Neanderthal populations. And some of these genes are in subpopulations of modern humans. Not all populations. In particular, they're not present in Africans. Remember, modern humans arose in Africa. They spread throughout Africa. They took over that entire continent. And then 80,000 years ago, they started moving into the Middle East and then spread into Europe and Asia. When they moved out there, they contacted Neanderthals. And what this is evidence that some of your great-great-grandparents were fooling around with Neanderthal man. There was genetic exchange between our two populations 100,000 years ago or so, which is kind of cool. So we can identify a whole bunch of genes that are present. Wow, this is a mainly white audience. So yeah, you guys are all Neanderthals. Except you. Yeah, although, you know, yeah, there's been all, this is another lesson of this is that there's been all kinds of interbreeding between races of human beings. We're all one species. You can find this exchange going on all over the place. What we're saying is if you look at a purebred African population, Africans who've never left the African continent, that all their ancestors have stayed there in Africa, they do not contain the taint of Neanderthal genes, whereas we Europeans and Asians and South Pacific Islanders do. This is another surprising thing about this result is, you know, there's a lot of speculation for a long time that, well, there's evidence that Europeans interbred with Neanderthals because you find a lot of Europeans with big noses and thick brows. And they're just saying on the basis of morphology, you know, that guy over there, he looks awful caveman-like. But what they found is that Europeans and Asians are carrying just as many of those Neanderthal genes. So you can't just go by looks alone. You have to look at the genes and ask, what genes are they being shared? And yeah, Europeans, Asians, and South Pacific Islanders, we've all got roughly the same amount of genetic material from our Neanderthal ancestors, which happens to be about 1% to 4% of our genes. We got those from Neanderthals. The other interesting thing about this is how this happened. You mustn't think that there was widespread interbreeding between these populations. Because there's only a tiny fraction of those Neanderthal genes in us, it was probably very limited. So that's what's being shown here. Well, I'll get to this in a minute. That what happened is that as modern humans moved into the Middle East, probably a few events occurred where they interbred. But it was probably very rare. Only a few Neanderthal genes leaked back into the human population. However, here's the thing. Those humans that moved in the Middle East, they were the leading edge of an expanding wave. So that population that carried along a few Neanderthal genes is the one that then expanded and exploded into Europe and Asia. And as they expanded, they carried along with them the Neanderthal genes. They've looked very carefully at the Neanderthal genes. They're not very interesting. They don't seem to be genes that do anything in particular for us. What they are is they piggybacked along with the human expansion into Europe and Asia. So we probably didn't get much benefit from these. They're just along for the ride. And the only reason we're seeing them now is because it was that smaller population of humans that were riding the wave of expansion, and they carried along those genes with them. There were probably also reciprocal exchanges. So Neanderthal populations also got human genes, but they don't show up in the Neanderthals. And why is that? It's because as the humans were expanding, the Neanderthals were contracting. So if you were one of those Neanderthals who interbred with humans at the boundaries of the frontier, you know, where you were interacting with each other, those genes didn't get very far because, I'm sorry, you were doomed to extinction. You're the first Neanderthals are going to get slaughtered by the expanding humans. So those genes didn't get very far. There were probably also cases where these genes worked themselves back into the African populations. But again, you've got a few genes coming from a shrinking population, going to a thriving, dynamic population of modern humans in Africa. They just got swamped out. You don't see them in the African populations. So complicated history going on there. The other thing is I want to mention this over here. They also look for genes that were special, that were unique to humans and weren't found in Neanderthal man. These are candidates for genes that make us different from Neanderthal. Furthermore, they were looking for genes that are universal in all humans. So again, I mentioned earlier, humans, that we're all one species, we've all been interbreeding. What they found is a set of genes that are unique to humans, and they are also present in European, Asian, South Pacific Islands, and African populations. So the genes that probably made us most successful were spreading all over the place. Africa was not that isolated. There was lots of gene flow going on. And they can ask, what are these genes? What are these genes that made us specially human? And they've got some candidates. You'll be surprised how few there are. There's a total of 78. So 78 genes that are unique to us and not to Neanderthals. And you ask, what are they? And you're probably dying to know. What are these special genes? You know, the ones that make us less hairy or something. There are a few genes that look really, really interesting, and these are the candidate genes that we're kind of excited about right now. Yes, you're laughing because these are all diseases, okay? The reason we know about these is because in mutant forms, they cause diseases. We know, for instance, that there is a gene called DYRK1A. It's associated with Down syndrome. If you've got too many copies of this gene, you end up with mental retardation. We know this. So that sort of suggests that this gene is involved in something going on in your brain. It's important in developing intelligence. Similarly, there's a gene called NRG3. There's a familiar form of schizophrenia that's associated with this. So people who are a little bit crazy are associated with this particular trait. There's also a couple of genes that are associated with autism. And this one I'll talk about in just a moment. But in general, these are genes that are exciting because we know from defects in these genes that they're involved in the formation of your brain. Neanderthals have a different form. Okay, they do not have the form that causes these problems. They have a different form altogether. We have a different form than they do. The fact that these are associated with brain stuff sort of suggests that maybe what's going on here is that these are genes that got tweaked in particular ways to make us uniquely human in the way we think. So these are interesting candidates for genes involved in the development of our particular kind of intelligence. This one has got people very excited. This one is called RUNX2. It's associated with a syndrome called cleidocranial dysplasia. Cleidocranial dysplasia is a fairly uncommon defect where what it does is it changes the structure of the skull. The cranial sutures don't form properly. They don't fuse until very late. The brain case gets kind of bulgy and odd-shaped. There's something called the Arnold head, which is a distinctive phenotype that you can see with the individuals with this particular disease. It also causes changes in the collarbone. That's the cleido part. So it changes the morphology of the clavicle. But one thing that you notice with people with this is that they tend to have very thick, beetling brows, and they have problems with their shoulder joint. Their shoulder joint is actually configured more like a Neanderthal shoulder joint. So this is a candidate for a gene that is involved in skeletal development that may have played a role in the difference between Neanderthals and modern humans in their form. So very cool stuff there. We'd like to know more about this. These are just candidates right now. We don't know what this gene does, right? All we know now is that Neanderthals and modern humans had a different form of this, which makes it extremely exciting to figure out exactly what it does. And you can bet that there will be money flowing into grants to do research on all of these genes in the near future. Because now we're very excited about these may be responsible for some of our very human differences. Okay, so here's this exciting stuff coming out of modern molecular biology. And I want you to think for just a minute, I want you to daydream a little bit and imagine that you are an Iron Age prophet. You are an Iron Age prophet. There you are, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. And of course, as a prophet of God, you have a direct line to an omniscient being who knows everything and can explain everything about the origin of the world to you. And you're going to write this down for your people so that they have an edge. You know, they got more knowledge because you've been talking to God, and God is telling them exactly how the universe was created, how you came to be, where you came from. He's giving you the full story. So here you are, an Iron Age prophet, direct line to God, and you call up and you ask him, okay, where did we come from? What will God say to you? Well, we know what God said to them. He said this. Okay, this is just the zoological part of Genesis. This is explaining where animal life came from. And I got to tell you, yeah, I know it's poetry, but it's complete drivel. It's completely wrong. This is what you might imagine a Mesopotamian scribe might come up if you asked him, okay, where did all the animals come from? And he's racking his brain trying to think of animals. What are the animals I know? Gosh, I know sheep, dogs. Okay, I know a few animals. And he's trying to think of a few animals, and he's going to say, okay, well, I'm going to list all the animals I know. And he has to get very general. He says, okay, flying animals and animals in the ocean. And he's going to explain where they came from. God did it. That's the depth of the explanation we're getting here. Few general classes of animals, God did it. This is not very informative. This isn't very impressive at all. This is like kindergarten version of creation. And it's written down in the book of Genesis as this revered knowledge that you have to respect and acknowledge. But seriously, any little kid could come up with something better than this nowadays. Seriously, kindergartners know more about the natural world than this guy who wrote this stuff down did. So, you know, this is bad, uninformative, uninteresting. It's terrible stuff. And here these guys are telling us they're getting this information directly from God. What kind of juvenile mind does God have? This is, again, where religion is completely wrong. You know, it's like God is telling him this stuff, and it's just the prelude, because he really wants to get to the cool part about the hot naked chick and the talking snake. And this is just stuff to get out of the way. But you know, if there were a God, if God were actually communicating with his prophets back then, here's what God could have said. And this would have impressed me. God could have written, he could have told this to his prophet. And really, it's one paragraph, no big words. This is all comprehensible to anybody. He could have said, okay, as many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, and as consequently there's a frequently recurring struggle for existence, it follows that any being, if it vary however slightly, in any manner profitable to itself, under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, will have a better chance of surviving and thus be naturally selected. From the strong principle of inheritance, any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form. Seriously, I wish God had told a few sheep herders about this. This is information they could have used. This is great stuff. This you could have used to breed new lines of sheep. You know, exercise a little selection in the flock, and you could get all kinds of interesting stuff out of this. But no, God didn't tell them this. We had to wait till 1859 for Charles Darwin to say this. And I know it's heretical to say this, but apparently Charles Darwin is much, much smarter than God. He came up with a much more interesting answer. And look at the drivel that you find in the book of Genesis. You know, it wasn't hard. This was difficult to come up with initially, but once Charles Darwin came with this, you know, everybody's smacking their head and saying, boy, why didn't I think of that before? That's so obvious now. God could have pulled the same stunt on those Mesopotamian scribes. In fact, God could have really dazzled everybody by, instead of the book of Genesis, he could have said, wash your hands. You know, he could have promoted good hygiene, and it would have been scientifically far more valid than all the stuff he rattled on about in the book of Genesis. And it would have saved millions of lives. It would have made his chosen people thrive compared to the tribes next door. But God didn't do this. So, you know, I have a challenge that I've been giving to people now. You know, Christopher Hitchens has his own challenge. You may have heard Christopher Hitchens' challenge. He says, okay, name one moral act that an atheist cannot do, but a believer in Christianity or Islam or whatever can do. Name one moral act that is excluded from the atheist population that makes Christians better than atheists. And so far they can't name one. There is none. But I would make a similar sort of claim. Can you name one example where religion has provided us with a novel insight, a revolutionary idea that actually tells us something useful and important about the natural world? Name one. And you can't, because there isn't one. So what you have to do is you have to go to science. Religion is wrong. Science isn't always right, but at least we have a method that works towards the truth. We have tools that we can use to figure out the answer. And that's why I'm saying religion is always wrong, science is always right. In principle. And with that, I'll show you my famous picture. And we'll turn it over to questions. Any questions? Oh. Yes. Now, that's pure slander against Neanderthal man. I'm sorry. I will not accept that. Yeah, you know, like I said, these are probably genes that just piggybacked along. We just inherited them by chance. I wouldn't blame anything on the Neanderthals, especially since we exterminated them. Seems kind of mean-spirited at this point. Yes, way back there. Ah, yes. Yeah, there is active ongoing debate in the scientific community about this. There are still a lot of people who say, well, morphology is the key, you know, life histories and so forth, embryology and et cetera. But the molecular biologists are winning. The surest, strongest evidence that you can find for relationships is now in the realm of DNA testing. And that makes sense, because when you look at DNA, you're looking directly at the material that's being transferred from generation to generation. And so, yeah, molecular biology seems to be the #1 answer. There are cases where we've been fooled by some of the similarities. Those are fewer and farther between as we get more and more data. You know, for instance, looking at whole genomes makes a difference versus looking at individual genes. 10 years ago, you just look at individual genes and you compare those, and there could be things like convergence and so forth that would confuse it. But nowadays, we look at whole genomes. And when you've got that much data, you can get a pretty solid answer. Yeah.
Is there a rate of genome change? Is it accelerating, decelerating? Where are we?
Well, that's a difficult one to say, because yes, there are known rates of genomic change. There are things called the molecular clock, for instance, and we know that if we look over long periods of time, we can see fairly consistent rates of change over time within the DNA, not necessarily within morphology. Morphology seems to change in fits and starts, but the DNA, we're undergoing progressive change all the time. Your question might be more like, is there evidence for evolutionary change in human populations now? And yes, there is. That if anything, modern human populations are evolving faster now than they did in the past. And that's because human populations are booming. We're expanding everywhere. We've been sort of freed from some of the constraints of natural selection, not all of them, but some of them. And what that means is we allow greater diversity to flourish within our populations. And that means that if you look at our DNA now, it's a mess. It's all over the place. We've got all kinds of mutations accumulating. Humanity is more diverse now than it ever was. And so in that sense, yeah, we're saying there is sort of an acceleration of evolution. However, we are not seeing right now significant purifying selection that is picking a particular form and saying this is the future of humanity. The future of humanity right now seems to be kind of an explosion going in all kinds of different directions. Yes?
Well, what I thought was interesting is that if we get our common ancestors 100,000 years ago in Neanderthal, then doesn't it say something really interesting about speciation, that we could exchange genes and that way?
Oh, yes. Yeah, well, you know, that it says something interesting, but it also says something that all biologists sort of accept, is that speciation is not flipping a switch. You don't suddenly go from one species to another. What you have is populations, large populations that are changing gradually over time, and those populations can overlap and interact. And so the boundary between two species is very fuzzy and blurry, and it extends over a long period of time. You know, we could interbreed with, this says that we could interbreed with Neanderthals probably right up to the moment they went extinct, which probably means we could have interbred with them even earlier, right? So throughout Neanderthal history, there was the potential for interbreeding with humans, but because we were isolated geographically, we didn't do it so much. In fact, if we hadn't been isolated geographically and we had been interbreeding, there would be no distinction between the two populations. We would be sort of Neanderthal human hybrids right now, and we just take it for granted. So yeah, it's confirming, again, another biological concept, which is that species are blurry and fuzzy around the edges. There's no hard edges at all. And that, again, promotes the idea of evolutionary biology. Yes?
I guess this is more to do with the latest articles that have gone on. The latest articles that I've read about Neanderthals, they were trying to say that, oh yeah, there's biologists, they got particles in the world.
All right. Yeah, there's been a couple of camps. So the question is about the model for speciation of the Neanderthals. And there's been a couple of camps that have been working for a long time. There's the multi-regional theory, and there's the out-of-Africa theory, which multi-regional theory says modern humans sort of evolved all over the place, all over the globe, gradually interbreeding with existing populations like Neanderthal, and that you can't see that there's a sharp boundary. The out-of-Africa hypothesis says, no, what happened is modern humans arose in Africa, they exploded onto the scene, and they went out and they simply replaced all the existing populations in Asia and Europe and drove them into extinction. This new data says, sort of a hybrid of those, it says, no, it's true. The out-of-Africa hypothesis is correct, that we are primarily related to Africans from 150,000 years ago, all of us, every single one in this room. But that as we expanded into Asia and Europe, there was some small degree of interbreeding. So, I would say that this evidence primarily favors the out-of-Africa hypothesis. The multi-regional hypothesis is mostly dead, but it's still propped up a little bit by the fact that, it's not an all or nothing thing. It's not black or white. We had some interbreeding with the other variants of humanity that were out there as we expanded. Okay, yes?
Just out of curiosity, has anybody figured out whether humans and chimps could interbreed as the most closely related ape species?
Oh, you're talking about an interesting ethical experiment. Yeah. Yeah, there's been some very theoretical discussions of this. There doesn't seem to be any significant barriers. So we think maybe they could, except that if you tried to breed with a chimpanzee, the chimpanzee would rip your arms off. Okay? So that kind of limits things right there, because yes, that would be, we could do that experiment where you could do it in vitro and then implant it in either a chimpanzee or a human host and let it come to term. Except for that ethical problem, what happens when you get a baby that's half human, half chimpanzee? Would you be willing to take this child on as yours and raise it to adulthood? And yeah. Well, yeah, and of course, and then it's kind of unfair to the kid, right? This is going to. Now you're getting into some very dicey ground. Mixed races, they're all human beings. This is a chimpanzee and a human. There's no comparison in the degree of difference there. But this would be an individual who would be very different from his friends in school, who would be, not just skin color, but all kinds of traits and probably differences in physical strength, differences in mental capacity and so forth. This would be a really terrible thing to do to a little kid. So yeah, there's the problem there. The other thing is there is some circumstantial evidence. Again, we can't test this directly because of the ethical problems, but there's some circumstantial evidence that there may be some very significant differences in some of the rate genes that are switched on early in development. And if you have a difference in development early on, that will have cascading effects farther downstream. So there's kind of an expectation that those may send development all going off in very strange directions, producing a non-viable embryo. Now again, we haven't done that experiment. There have been some rumors out of Russia that they did these experiments with in vitro fertilization and just let it go on for a few weeks just to see what would happen. And no, they got no viable embryos out of it. But this has not been published anywhere. It's just been sort of a floating rumor in the scientific community that happened many, many years ago. And that sort of suggested it wouldn't work, that you wouldn't get a viable embryo out of it. Yeah. In the back, in the green shirt. Oh. Yeah, well, you know, I mentioned a few genes up there that are associated with autism. And the thing is that all the associations are kind of weak and shaky because you don't find these particular alleles in all individuals with autism. So you find individuals who are autistic but don't have that particular form. They have the normal form or the standard form. And vice versa, you find individuals who carry that particular allele but are not autistic by any diagnosis. So it's another example of very complicated patterns of inheritance. We're not sure exactly what's going on there. These are things that have to be studied in more detail. We have to ask, you know, what we've got now is correlations. That many autistic individuals may carry this particular trait. We don't know what the trait does. So it may be very indirect, it may be coincidental. We don't know. So no, I would say there's no good evidence. There's also pretty strong evidence that autism and ADD and so forth are strongly shaped by environmental factors, you know, how you're brought up, your culture, what you've been exposed to, which complicates it yet further. We haven't untangled nature and nurture at all in these particular syndromes. Okay, in the back there. Oh, the Ray Comfort story. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, this is a common argument from the creationists. Ray Comfort makes this one all the time. He said things like, well, you know, the first elephant would have evolved, and he assumes it would have been male because males always come first. And yes, double entendre. Oh well. Anyway, and this elephant would have had to look around to find a female to mate with, and there would be none, so it would go extinct. That's his argument. It's totally bogus because, first of all, evolution does not proceed by individuals. Evolution proceeds by populations. So whole populations would have changed. And also, as we saw with the Neanderthal human data, there would have been a huge overlap. So there would have been elephants gradually evolving in populations, subpopulations of pre-elephants. They would have been able to breed within their own population, or been able to breed with other populations. And what we saw is a gradual shift by selection in which traits promote to the next generation. So yeah, like you say, it's because this is fuzzy, that there's no sharp boundary. If you're trying to pretend that there is one to argue against evolution, you're completely wrong-headed, like Ray Comfort. Okay.
I'm going to quote some really advanced science here. Do you see any possibility that...
I'll repeat the question.
Do you see any possibility that they could do some kind of a Jurassic Park type experiment with the Neanderthal genome to kind of recreate it or
Yeah.
study?
Yes, can you take this information from the Neanderthal genome and recreate a Neanderthals nowadays? And we can't now. That technology isn't there. Because what you need is a couple of technological breakthroughs. You need to be able to make high fidelity sequence. You need to be able to regenerate that entire sequence. You have to get it into cells, and you have to condition it in the same way that our genome is conditioned by presence in the gametes and so forth. So there's a lot of technological hurdles. Those will be overcome. Someday we'll be able to do that. And then you run into those annoying ethical concerns, right? Yeah. Mad scientists aren't supposed to follow those, but society keeps saying, no, you can't do this experiment. You know, I would say give it 10 years or so and we'll be able to do it. We'll be able to recreate the Neanderthal genome. We'll be able to implant it into an oocyte in a sperm and get the whole project going. But then the question is, well, whether we should and whether we'll be allowed to do it. And I have my doubts because, again, you'll have a little Neanderthal child all by himself, unless you made a tribe with him. Yeah, you know, so it's a really difficult issue. The ethics of it are are very dicey. Although, you know, I would think that one interesting thing, have you heard of the Pleistocene rewilding scheme? That population, I know there's some people from the Dakotas here. The idea is that Dakota population is shrinking. Well, let's just complete the process, move everybody out. Maybe we can spread this to the whole Midwest. Just get rid of everybody in the Midwest and restore the populations from 30,000 years ago. You know, bring back the bison, bring back mountain lions, bring back all these animals, and just let them run wild in this big empty tract in the middle of America. Again, we have to get rid of the people who are living there. Small problem. They're leaving anyway, and rebuild it. And then, of course, maybe you could think about this. Well, maybe we could restore a Neanderthal population. Because it's cool. But, and I know that carries very little weight with the people who have ethical concerns. Maybe coolness is not enough to overcome the other issues. But you know, it's the kind of thing mad scientists will speculate about. Yeah. Oh, how far back can we reconstruct this? Well, as I mentioned, with these data, they have sort of reconstructed what the common ancestor of Neanderthal and modern humans would have been like. So, you know, genetically, they know what they can predict what the sequence most likely was. So we can push it back that far. We don't have sequence for things like Homo erectus and so forth. That's going to be really hard to get. We do have sequence for things like chimpanzees, and we can ask those. Also, we can extrapolate back. But the farther back we go, and the more divergent the populations are, the fuzzier the data gets. It gets really blurry the farther and farther back you go.
Within the human population, like Amy, you have this common trait with grass.
Oh, right. Well, the more information we get, the more accurate it is. But yes, if we have, you know, right now you can do things like trace back family trees way, way back genetically. Ask Lynn Feldman about this. That you can do all kinds of interesting things, you know, looking at how the sequence has changed as our ancestors migrated out of Africa and through Europe and Asia and so forth. And we can extrapolate back to the most likely ancestral sequence of the last common ancestor of all living humans. And yeah, we kind of have a picture of that. And of course, that person was a human being, you know. Looked like all of us. Sort of a blend of all of us, I imagine. Yes?
And I was reading that scientists in the southern hemisphere are saying that evolution is happening quickly there. And from what I understand, and I'd like you to comment on this, that apparently white people are getting darker.
Oh, that's kind of simplistic. But yeah, evolution is happening rapidly everywhere. That we're all changing in the sense of our populations changing. And yeah, but you know, it goes both ways. That as there's an admixture of brown people and light-skinned people, the brown-skinned populations are getting lighter and the light-skinned ones are getting darker. Yeah, so we're kind of moving in that direction. But at the same time, of course, the inheritance of traits like skin color are fairly complicated. And they can go in all kinds of different directions. They tend to assort over multiple generations. What we're getting is greater diversity. We're not converging on some big smear of, well, everybody will look the same in the future. That's not happening at all. What we've got is this variety of alleles that are being sorted out among all of us, and we're seeing increased diversity everywhere.
Just two more questions.
Two more questions. Okay, over here.
I was curious about carbon dating. How is discrediting that? Christians don't have any basis for the 6,000 years theory?
Oh, right. Well, there's a whole bunch of things that contradict 6,000 years. I mean, not just carbon dating, but we have historical records that go back farther than that. We have tree ring data that goes back farther than that. We have ice core data that goes way, way back farther than that. All of that contradicts the creationists. That's why I'm saying that what we're seeing now in modern creationists is this kind of hardening of their position, a complete outright rejection of all of modern science. They have to in order to support their views. Okay, last one right here.
In the embryology of a chicken egg, apparently there's a tail also that
Yes.
the chicken has that disappears as it
Yes. This is
I heard
also,
somebody say that within 5 years, they might be able to make that tail not disappear and you'll get a chicken with a piece of,
right. There's,
tail.
I'm trying to remember his name, and I'm blanking on it. Who's the famous paleontologist out in Montana? Horner, yes.
I don't remember who it was, but I was
Yeah.
wondering what you think about
Horner
that.
has written a book called How to Make a Dinosaur. And he has suggested that this would be a cool experiment to do, that what you can do is start with a chicken, which is just a highly evolved dinosaur, and you could start mutating it looking for revertants. And what you could do is you could get a chicken that grows a tail, a chicken that gets rid of most of its feathers, a chicken that has teeth, and within a few generations, a few dozen generations, a few hundred generations, something like that, you could probably get a chicken that would be like this big and would look like a small theropod dinosaur. And he's seriously proposing this as a line of research for the future, is let's start not by genetic engineering, but by simple breeding experiments, let's rebuild dinosaurs. He thinks we can do it. I kind of think he's right. We probably could get something. It wouldn't be an original dinosaur. It would be a modern dinosaur, but it would be something that you could easily breed a chicken that looked semi-easily. Breed a chicken that would look like a little Coelurosaur or something, some little nasty little theropod running around eating things. Which again would be cool. And the ethicists don't say we can't do that yet. Okay, it's a chicken, and it's just using common breeding techniques, so we could do it. Okay, thank you.
Dr. Reminders will be around for you to meet and speak with, and then at 4 o'clock, a lot of us are going over to cucumbers. So we'll see you there.